Hey everybody, Phil here. I call this video Don't Forget the Board because play can look very similar across different board textures. And if you've studied enough spots, again and again, and presumably just by nature of not being able to ensure that you cover every single board or cover every single board for the same amount of time, you're going to kind of develop habits and patterns where, let's say you're facing a turn C bet on a dynamic board. You say, okay, well, my sets do this, and my top two pair do this, my middle two pair do this, and my threshold for being able to call is here. The problem is this can lead to mistakes because not all boards are created equal, and the two major ways that shows up. First one is board texture. Some boards are drier, some boards are wetter than others. Second is range advantage. On some boards, one player is going to have a pretty sizable range advantage, and on other boards, they're not going to. On other boards, sometimes it's very even, and it can go the other way, of course. And so those things do dictate how you play. And if you're not paying attention to them at all, you're going to be making some mistakes. You're going to be playing too loose on boards that are bad for you, too loose on boards that are wetter, and then too tight on boards that are drier, too tight on boards that are good for you, too passive as well. So let's get into it. So we'll start with a very obvious difference in board texture example. We raise the button and we get called. The flop is Jack 10-4. Now on one hand we have Jack 10-4 with a flush draw. On the other we have Jack 10-4 rainbow. We all know that these are different boards. Now if we look at the makeup of our range, we have 5% sets. We have 11% two pair. We have 10% over pairs, 13.5% top pair, and then we have 16% open enders without any of the above. But on Jack 10-4 two-tone, we also have 22% flush draws, 22.5%, or 10% if we remove everything else. So our standards and our thresholds have to be raised, both with value bets, semi-bluffs, defends. And the same thing is true of boards with fewer straight draws or more straight draws. It just has to change things. So if you have in your head, I have top pair plus open ender, it does this. Oh, I have middle pair plus nut gut shot, it does this. It doesn't carry over board to board. You need different strategies on the two-tone board and on the rainbow board. All right, so following up from that concept, we're going to look at pair plus gut shot on a couple of different boards. So again, we have the Jack 10-4 two-tone flop that we just talked about, and we have a Queen 7-3 two-tone flop. And in each cases, we're going to look at bottom pair plus a gut shot. So in this scenario, we're going to be out of position and facing a continuation bet. And the first thing to note is with 8-7-4, of course, without any additional useful equity, no flush draw, no two pair, no set, etc. 8-7-4 always folds against a bet, which should, well, maybe it's not obvious to everybody, but it's a very weak hand on this board. That said, people who get carried away with, okay, I have pair plus gut shot, especially people coming over from no limit, can overvalue this hand quite a bit. Now to contrast that, on Queen 7-3, take a hand 3-4-5. That hand with no additional equity is only folding 25% of the time, as opposed to 100% of the time. Now, a more accurate comparison, because that's actually a nut gut shot and 8-7 is a third nut gut shot, would be a hand like Ace-Queen-4 on the Jack 10-4 board. So even with Ace-Queen-4, which by the way has two overcards to top two pair, which 3-4-5 does not on the Queen 7-3 board, even Ace-Queen-4 is folding more often than 3-4-5. It's folding 42% of the time. And keep in mind, again, not only does it have the two overcards, it also can have the Ace of Hearts or the Queen of Hearts, which is going to be a really key card on this board. So despite that hand being stronger, they both have bottom pair plus nut gut shot. Ace Queen always has two overcards. 3-4-5 can only have one overcard at most, and a lot of these don't. And the Ace Queen 4 can have the Ace of Hearts or the Queen of Hearts, both of which are key cards on this board. 3-4-5 is still folding less frequently. Now, the reason for that is not because it's a kind of higher equity hand against two pair or higher equity hand against top pair or anything like that. It's not. It's lower. The reason for that is if you're defending every hand like ace queen 4 on the jack 10-4 board, you're just calling way too much because you have so many more draws at your disposal. You know, on queen 7-3, there are 0 open enders. You can't have an open ender. You can have 3 gut shots, and you have each of those around 7% of the time. So like 20% of the time, you're going to have a straight draw. We're going to cover more of that in the next video. And then on jack 10-4, well, now you can have king queen, queen 9, 9-8. Those are open enders. You have those about 20% of the time. And then you can have ace queen, ace king. You can have king 9, queen 8, 9-7, 6-7. And now we've gotten into like, you know, I mean, there's going to be some overlap. So let's call it like mid 40s. So instead of 20% straight draws, you have like 45% straight draws. And a lot of them are open enders, which are really strong hands. So now if you're using kind of the same mental framework for what's good enough to call with on jack 10-4, you're going to be, you know, maybe calling a c-bet 75% of the time. And on queen 7-3, you're maybe going to call a c-bet something like 38% of the time. Or rather not fold to a c-bet, I should say, because you have raising ranges on each. So be aware that even though it may feel the same to have these hand categories, or actually feel like ace queen 4 is stronger, if you're playing all of those hands, if you're continuing with all of those hands, you're continuing too much. Maybe that's okay, because maybe your opponent's kind of making the same mistake with their c-bet range and betting way too much and betting too many weak semi-bluffs and weak bluffs and things like that, and too many weak value bets that you can win the pot against later. But drawing on our last video, what you're incentivizing them to do is c-bet a really strong range because you're just way over calling. And then on queen 7-3, you're incentivizing them to bluff a lot because you're going to be overfolding. So other than board texture, the way the boards can differ is who has the range advantage. Now, obviously, based on pre-flop play, one player is going to have more high pairs and high cards and potentially high suits. And then, of course, it carries over to the flop turn river, because if one player has check raised the flop, there are certain turns, or I mean, most turns are better for them. They're going to have the range advantage. Similarly, if somebody's got the betting lead, they're going to have the range advantage. But there are certain cards that matter more. So take that jack 10-4 board, for example. Let's say that imposition c-bets and gets called, and the turn is an offsuit deuce. That's a good card for imposition because it has an improved out of positions range to hands that beat imposition's value range on the flop, because the deuce is such a brick. Whereas if the turn is a queen, that changes things a little bit, evens things out a little bit. So keep in mind who has the range advantage, because whoever has the range advantage gets to take kind of that. You have your mental framework of hands. Okay, I can do this with my sets. I can do this with my two pair. I can do this with my combo draws. And you're already adjusting for board texture. You still get to play all of those hands a little bit more aggressively if you have the range advantage, and a little bit less aggressively if you have the range disadvantage. Similarly with defense, you know, if you have a big range disadvantage and you're facing aggression, a lot of times you get to overfold. So you take those same hand categories and you get to fold. And even if you don't get to overfold, sometimes you just, like, you don't have those higher hands as often, so you fold a roughly appropriate amount. And similarly, if you have a big range advantage, you definitely cannot overfold. So you'll see this sometimes in 3-bet pots where out of position bets on a board that is really good for imposition, like 8-6-4 rainbow, let's say. Now, some people check full range on that board. I do, I think. But some people don't, and they just kind of like make the mistake of c-betting too often across all board textures. Make sure that you're not overfolding that board. You actually have to way over defend if they're over c-betting. This concept can carry through to the river as well. Obviously, whoever has the range advantage is going to dictate, the river action, usually the aggressor on the previous street, but sometimes it goes the other way. Sometimes it's very clear that imposition is playing their hand in a way that they have like a whole bunch of the top hand class on the turn, whether it be a set or a flush or a straight. So then when the board changes such that, on a board with no flush or straight, a flush and a straight come in, well, now out of position has a lot of hands that might want to donk river. Similarly, if on a flush board, the in position is played really aggressively, and now the board pairs, in position is going to be, have very few boats, and out of position needs to play those spots aggressively. Also, though, if you find yourself in a spot where you just don't have a lot of value bettable hands, either because of the way that you've played or the makeup of your whatever pre-flop range, whatever the case may be, you can't bluff as much, obviously. And now this is maybe an obvious concept of, I know that I have this many value bets, I need to have this many bluffs to make my opponent indifferent, but people struggle with it sometimes because they have these kind of hand categories in their head of what makes a good bluff. Okay, so I block bottom pair and I have one straight blocker and I have one flush blocker. This hand's always a bluff. Or I have bottom two pair and the board is paired. This is always one of my bluff raises. Well, if you don't have a lot of boats based on the way you played the hand earlier, obviously you still have some and you get to bluff raise some. But if you don't have many, and now you're bluffing all of those hands that you would normally bluff on a board where you have a lot of boats, you're going to be way over bluffing. Hopefully, now with all of that in mind, you have a good idea about how to adjust kind of everything we've talked about up until this point to the board texture so that you're not underplaying or overplaying too drastically, and you can keep an eye out for when your opponents do that. So you are good here. Let's get into the next video.